Welcome, brave souls, to another tale from the ancient lands of the North. Before we journey into this epic story of dragons and destiny, please show your support by hitting that like button, subscribing to our channel for more Nordic legends, and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. We love hearing from our global Viking community. Now settle in for a tale that will change how you see courage, destiny, and the bonds between man and beast. The morning mist clung to the mountainsides like the breath of sleeping giants, and in the valley below, the village of Nordhelm stirred with the familiar sounds of another day. Smoke rose from thatched roofs, children's laughter echoed between the wooden houses, and the steady rhythm of hammers on metal rang from the blacksmith's forge. It was a scene of peaceful prosperity, yet beneath this tranquil surface lay a tension that had gripped the community for weeks. Young Torvin sat at the edge of the village, his back against the rough bark of an ancient pine tree, watching the morning unfold with eyes that held wisdom beyond his 18 winters. His blonde hair caught the early sunlight, and his lean frame spoke of someone who had grown tall quickly, still waiting for the broad shoulders and thick muscles that marked true Viking warriors. In his hands, he held a simple wooden flute, carved from birchwood by his own patient fingers during the long winter months. The melody that drifted from the instrument was unlike anything the village elders had ever heard in their war songs or celebration chants. It was haunting and beautiful, weaving through the air like golden thread, carrying notes that seemed to speak of ancient forests, forgotten dreams, and mysteries that lay beyond the visible world. The tune had no words, yet it told stories that touched something deep within anyone who truly listened. "Still wasting time with that stick and holes, I see," came a gruff voice from behind him. Torvin didn't need to turn to know it belonged to Magnus Stormax, one of the village's most respected warriors, and the father of his childhood friend, Leif. The older man's disapproval was evident in every syllable, though there was no true malice in his tone. Only the frustration of someone who couldn't understand what he saw as misplaced priorities. "Good morning, Magnus," Torvin replied calmly, lowering his flute but keeping his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "The sun rises beautifully today, don't you think? The way it paints the snow peaks with gold reminds me of the stories my grandmother used to tell about the halls of the gods." Magnus snorted, though not without a hint of fondness for the young man. "Poetry and music won't save us from what's coming, boy. The dragon strikes again tonight, mark my words. 3 villages in the past month, and each time it grows bolder. We need warriors with steel in their hands and fire in their bellies, not dreamers with wooden toys." The dragon, the very mention of the creature sent a chill through Torvin's heart, though not for the reasons one might expect. For weeks now, the great beast had been terrorizing the surrounding settlements, appearing without warning to wreak havoc before disappearing into the mountain caves. But what puzzled Torvin was the pattern of destruction. The dragon seemed to avoid actually harming people, focusing instead on destroying grain stores, livestock pens, and defensive structures. It was as if the creature was searching for something specific, growing increasingly frustrated when it couldn't find what it sought. "Have you considered," Torvin said carefully, "that perhaps the dragon isn't attacking randomly? There's a pattern to its behavior, almost like it's trying to communicate something." Magnus's weathered face creased into a scowl. "Communicate? Dragons are beasts of destruction, nothing more. They understand only strength and dominance. That's why the elders are preparing the ritual combat trials. Every able-bodied man must prove his worth as a berserker warrior. Even you, Torvin, despite your unconventional approach to things." Torvin's stomach tightened at the mention of the trials. The berserker rage was a sacred tradition among his people, a battle fury that transformed ordinary men into unstoppable forces of nature on the battlefield. Warriors would work themselves into a frenzy of aggression, becoming so consumed by the desire for combat that they felt no pain and showed no mercy. It was considered the highest form of Viking martial prowess, and those who couldn't achieve this state were often viewed as lacking the essential warrior spirit. I understand the importance of protecting our people, Torvin said diplomatically, but perhaps there are different kinds of strength. My grandmother always said that the greatest warriors were those who could choose when to fight and when to seek another path. Your grandmother was a wise woman, Magnus acknowledged, but wisdom won't help when dragonfire is burning down your home. The creature struck Easthold 3 nights ago, completely destroyed their winter food stores. If we don't stop it soon, half the region will starve before spring arrives. As Magnus walked away, shaking his head in a mixture of frustration and affection, Torvin returned his attention to his flute. He began to play again, but this time the melody was different, sadder, more contemplative. It spoke of loneliness and misunderstanding, of trying to find one's place in a world that seemed to value only one kind of strength. The morning progressed, and gradually other villagers began their daily routines. Torvin watched as the blacksmith's apprentices hauled water from the well, as merchants arranged their wares in the small market square, as mothers called their children in for the morning meal. It was a community he loved deeply, yet he often felt like an outsider looking in, separated by his different perspective on strength and courage. His friend Leif appeared around midday, jogging over with the easy confidence that came from never doubting one's place in the world. Tall and broad-shouldered like his father, Leif had already proven himself in several minor battles and was widely expected to excel in the upcoming Berserker trials. "There you are," Leif said, settling down beside Torvin with a friendly punch to the shoulder. "I've been looking for you. Father wants all the young men to gather at the training grounds this afternoon. We're going to practice the battle fury techniques before the formal trials begin." So Torvin sighed, carefully placing his flute in the leather pouch at his belt. "I suppose I have no choice in the matter. Come now, it's not as bad as all that," Leif said with a grin. "I know you have your own way of seeing things, but maybe if you just try to let go, let the anger build up. Remember when we were children and older boys would steal your practice sword? You got angry enough then." "That was different," Torvin replied. "That anger came from frustration and hurt feelings. The Berserker rage is something else entirely. It's about embracing destruction as an end in itself. I'm not sure I can do that, even to protect people I care about." Leif's expression grew more serious. "Torvin, I've known you since we were small children building snow forts together. You have courage. I've seen it. Remember when little Astrid fell through the ice on the pond last winter? You didn't hesitate for a second before diving in after her, even though the water was so cold it could have stopped your heart. That took real bravery." "But that's exactly what I mean," Torvin said earnestly. "I helped Astrid because I wanted to save her, not because I wanted to hurt something else. The Berserker way is about channeling rage and aggression. What if there's another kind of strength, something that comes from understanding rather than domination?" Leif was quiet for a moment, considering his friend's words. Despite their different approaches to life, he genuinely respected Torvin's thoughtfulness and had seen enough to know that his friend's gentle nature often masked a deeper kind of wisdom. "Maybe you're right about there being different kinds of strength," Leif said finally. "But right now, with the dragon threatening everything we hold dear, we need to use whatever strength we have. Will you at least come to the training? Not to become something you're not, but to learn what you can." Torvin nodded reluctantly. He understood that his participation was about more than personal choice. It was about showing solidarity with his community during a time of crisis. "I'll come, but I won't pretend to be something I'm not." The afternoon training session took place in a large clearing just outside the village, surrounded by tall pines that seemed to watch like ancient sentinels. The village elders had set up various training stations, wooden practice weapons, targets for spear throwing, and circular areas marked in the dirt for wrestling matches. But the focus of today's session was different from ordinary combat training. This was about learning to access the Berserker rage that would be essential in the formal trials. Elder Grimm, the village's most respected warrior priest, stood in the center of the gathering, his white beard braided with small bones and metal rings that clicked softly when he moved his head. His voice carried easily across the clearing, as he addressed the dozen young men who had assembled for training. "Warriors of Nordhelm," he began, his weathered hands clasped behind his back, "we face a threat unlike any in living memory. The dragon that plagues our region shows no sign of moving on to other hunting grounds. It grows bolder with each attack, and soon it may threaten our own homes and families directly. In 3 days' time, we will hold the formal trials to select our finest berserker warriors. These chosen few will form the war party that ventures into the mountains to face this beast." Torvin felt the weight of expectation settling on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. Around him, his companions straightened with pride and determination, their faces already showing the fierce expressions they were trying to cultivate. He envied their certainty, their ability to embrace the role that their culture expected of them without question. "The berserker rage is not mere anger," Grim continued, beginning to pace slowly around the group. "It is a sacred transformation, a communion with the warrior spirits of our ancestors. When you achieve true berserker fury, you become more than human. You become an instrument of righteous destruction, capable of feats that would be impossible in your ordinary state." The elder began to demonstrate breathing techniques, methods for building internal tension and channeling it into aggressive energy. Torvin followed along mechanically, trying to focus his mind on generating the required emotional state. But instead of feeling the rising tide of battle fury that he saw in his companions' faces, he found himself thinking about the dragon itself. What must it feel like to be such a creature, to be so powerful yet so alone? The stories described dragons as ancient beings, possessed of intelligence that rivaled or exceeded that of humans. If that was true, then the dragon's seemingly random attacks might actually be attempts at communication, a frustration born from being unable to make itself understood. "Torvin!" Grim's sharp voice cut through his reverie like a blade. "You're supposed to be building rage, not daydreaming. Focus your mind on your enemies, on the threats to everything you hold dear. Feel that anger growing in your chest like a flame." "I'm trying, Elder," Torvin replied honestly. "But when I think about our enemies, I find myself wondering why they're enemies in the first place. What drives them to conflict? What do they hope to achieve?" A murmur of confusion and disapproval rippled through the group of trainees. This kind of philosophical questioning was entirely contrary to the mindset they were supposed to be developing. Grim's expression hardened, though there was a flicker of something that might have been curiosity in his ancient eyes. "A warrior who hesitates to act because he's wondering about his enemy's motivations is a dead warrior," Grim said sternly. "There will be time for philosophy after the battle is won. For now, you must learn to act decisively, without doubt or hesitation." The training continued for several more hours, with various exercises designed to help the young men access their aggressive instincts. They practiced battle cries, worked themselves into states of physical and emotional intensity, and engaged in mock combat that grew increasingly fierce as the afternoon progressed. Torvin participated as best he could, but he could see the disappointment in Grim's eyes and feel the concerned glances of his fellow trainees. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the training ground, Grim called for the session to end. The young men were exhausted, their faces flushed with exertion and their clothes soaked with sweat. Most of them showed clear signs of having achieved at least partial berserker states during the exercises, their eyes still bright with residual battle fury. "You have all shown promise today," Grim announced, though his gaze deliberately avoided Torvin. "Continue practicing these techniques over the next 3 days. Remember, the trials will determine not just individual glory, but the very survival of our community. Do not let us down." As the group began to disperse, Leif fell into step beside Torvin, his expression troubled. "That didn't go well for you, did it?" "I don't think the berserker path is meant for me," Torvin admitted quietly. "Every time I try to build up that kind of rage, my mind starts thinking about alternatives. I can't seem to shut off the part of me that wants to understand rather than simply react." "Maybe that's not entirely a bad thing," Leif said thoughtfully. "But Torvin, You have to find some way to prove yourself in the trials. If you're seen as unwilling or unable to defend the community, you'll be marked as a coward. That's not a burden you want to carry for the rest of your life. That evening, Torvald sat alone in his small cottage, staring into the flickering flames of his hearth fire. His parents had died in a winter plague when he was barely 14, leaving him to fend for himself in a world that increasingly seemed to have no place for someone of his temperament. The cottage was simple but comfortable, filled with small carvings and musical instruments that he had crafted during the long winter months. He picked up his flute again and began to play, letting the melody flow without conscious thought. The music seemed to take on a life of its own, weaving patterns that spoke of longing and hope, of connection across impossible distances. As he played, Torvald found himself thinking about the dragon again, imagining what it might be like to live in such isolation, to be so misunderstood that communication seemed impossible. The melody grew more complex, incorporating themes that seemed to come from some deep wellspring of intuition rather than conscious composition. It was unlike anything he had ever played before, ancient and primal, yet somehow familiar, as if he was remembering rather than creating. The notes seemed to hang in the air long after they had been played, creating harmonies that resonated with something fundamental in the natural world. Outside his cottage, unbeknownst to Torvald, the night itself seemed to be listening. Small animals that normally scurried about their nocturnal business paused in their activities, drawn by something in the music that spoke to them on a level beyond ordinary sound. Even the wind seemed to quiet, as if the very air was holding its breath to better hear the haunting melody. Far away in the mountains, in caves that had not seen sunlight for centuries, something else was listening too. Ancient eyes opened in the darkness, and a great head lifted with sudden, intense attention. The dragon had heard something that spoke to the deepest part of its being, a sound that bridged the gap between species and touched on truths that transcended the boundaries of ordinary understanding. 3 days passed, like the turning of seasons in the north, slowly, yet with an inexorable sense that everything was about to change forever. The morning of the Berserker trials dawned clear and cold, with a crisp wind that carried the scent of pine and snow from the distant peaks. The entire village had gathered in the great assembly area at the heart of Nordhelm, their breath forming small clouds in the frigid air as they waited for the ceremonies to begin. Torvald stood with the other candidates at the edge of the crowd, trying to calm the nervous flutter in his stomach. He had spent the previous 3 days in intense practice, attempting to master the breathing techniques and mental exercises that were supposed to unlock the Berserker rage. Despite his best efforts, he had achieved only the faintest echo of the transformation that came so naturally to his peers. The realization that he might genuinely fail the trials had begun to weigh heavily on his mind. The testing ground had been prepared according to ancient traditions. A large circle had been marked in the earth with sacred stones, each one carved with runes that told the stories of legendary warriors from generations past. Inside the circle, various weapons had been arranged: axes, swords, spears, and shields, all crafted by the village's finest smiths, specifically for this ceremony. The weapons gleamed in the morning sunlight, their edges honed to razor sharpness, despite being intended for ritual combat rather than actual battle. Elder Grimm stepped forward, resplendent in ceremonial robes that had been passed down through countless generations of warrior priests. The fabric was deep blue wool, decorated with silver thread that formed intricate patterns, representing the flight of ravens and the howl of wolves. Around his neck hung a magnificent amulet, crafted from the tooth of some ancient beast, polished to ivory smoothness and inscribed with runes so old that only the eldest scholars could still read their meaning. "People of Nordhelm," Grimm's voice carried easily across the assembled crowd, "today we witness a sacred rite that connects us to our ancestors and to the very essence of what it means to be a warrior of the North. These young men will demonstrate their worthiness to stand against the forces that threaten our way of life. The trials began with individual demonstrations of martial skill. Each candidate was called forward to display his proficiency with various weapons, to show his physical strength and coordination through a series of challenging exercises. Leif performed magnificently, his movements flowing from one technique to another with the grace of someone born to warfare. When his turn came to attempt the berserker transformation, he threw back his head and released a battle cry that seemed to shake the very ground, his eyes taking on the wild gleam that marked a true warrior in the grip of sacred fury. Other candidates followed, each displaying their own interpretation of the berserker ideal. Some roared like wild animals, others moved with deadly precision that spoke of countless hours of training. The crowd cheered appreciatively as each young man demonstrated the qualities that would make him valuable in the coming battle against the dragon. Finally, inevitably, Torvund's name was called. He walked into the circle with as much dignity as he could muster, acutely aware of the hundreds of eyes focused on him. The weight of their expectations felt heavier than any armor, and he could sense the mixture of hope and skepticism in their collective gaze. Many had known him since childhood and had seen his gentler nature, but they also hoped that the crisis might awaken hidden depths of warrior spirit within him. The weapon trials went reasonably well. While Torvund lacked the raw physical power of some candidates, he demonstrated solid technical skill and good tactical thinking. His movements were economical and precise, showing that he understood the principles of combat, even if he didn't embrace them with the same enthusiasm as his peers. The crowd's response was politely appreciative, though notably less enthusiastic than it had been for previous demonstrations. Then came the moment that everyone was waiting for. The berserker transformation itself. Torvund stood in the center of the circle, closed his eyes, and tried to summon the rage that was supposed to be every warrior's birthright. He thought about the dragon's attacks, about the fear in children's eyes when the great beast's roar echoed across the valley, about the destruction of food stores that might lead to starvation in the coming winter. For a moment, he felt something stirring within him, not quite anger, but a fierce protectiveness that made his heart beat faster and his muscles tense with readiness. But as he tried to nurture this feeling into the full berserker fury, his mind began its familiar pattern of questioning and analysis. Why was the dragon attacking food stores rather than people? What was it trying to achieve? Could there be a way to resolve this conflict without bloodshed? The moment of potential transformation slipped away like water through his fingers. When Torvund opened his eyes, he saw disappointment and concern written clearly on the faces of the elders and spectators. He had failed to achieve even a basic berserker state, marking him as unsuitable for inclusion in the war party that would face the dragon. Elder Grim's expression was grave, but not unkind, as he approached Torvund in the center of the circle. "You have shown skill with weapons and courage in facing this trial," he said formally, his words carrying to the entire assembled crowd. "However, the berserker rage remains beyond your reach. You will not be selected for the war party." The words hit Torvund like a physical blow, even though he had expected them. Around him, he could hear murmurs of sympathy mixed with disappointment from people who had hoped to see him succeed. His failure was not just personal, it reflected on the community's ability to stand together against external threats. As the trials concluded and the successful candidates were announced, Torvund slipped away from the crowd and made his way to his favorite thinking spot at the edge of the village. The ancient pine tree that had sheltered his morning meditations welcomed him again, its familiar presence offering comfort in this moment of public failure. He pulled out his flute and began to play, not caring who might hear or what they might think about his priorities. The melody that emerged was melancholy, but not despairing. It spoke of acceptance, of understanding that sometimes one's path lay in directions that others couldn't see or appreciate. As he played, Torvund found himself thinking about his grandmother's stories, the old tales that spoke of different kinds of heroism and alternative forms of strength. His grandmother had been a remarkable woman, a healer and storyteller who had commanded respect throughout the region for her wisdom and insight. She'd often told Torvin that the world needed many different types of people, that strength came in forms that weren't always recognized or celebrated. The loudest warrior, she used to say, is not always the bravest, and the strongest arm is not always attached to the strongest heart. As the afternoon wore on, Torvin became aware that he was not alone. Small forest creatures had begun to gather at the edge of the clearing. Squirrels, rabbits, even a young deer that watched him with large, gentle eyes. His music seemed to create a sphere of peace that drew these normally skittish animals into a state of calm curiosity. He had noticed this phenomenon before, but had never given it much thought. Today, surrounded by creatures that showed no fear of his presence, he began to wonder if there might be significance in this unusual connection. The sun was beginning to set when Leif found him, still playing softly beneath the pine tree with his audience of woodland creatures scattered around the clearing. His friend's face showed a mixture of concern and excitement that suggested important news. "Torvin," Leif said quietly, careful not to startle the animals, "I've been looking everywhere for you. Something's happening. Something big." "Let me guess," Torvin replied with a weak smile, setting down his flute. "The dragon has been spotted again, and the war party is preparing to march out tonight." "That's part of it," Leif confirmed, settling down beside his friend, while the small animals gradually dispersed back into the forest. "But there's more. The dragon didn't just attack randomly this time. It came straight for our village. It's circling the mountains above us right now, and the scouts say it's behaving differently than before. Instead of destroying things and flying away, it seems to be waiting for something." Torvin felt a strange chill run down his spine, though not from fear. "Waiting for what?" "Nobody knows," Leif admitted. "Elder Grimm thinks it might be preparing for a final, decisive attack. He's ordered the war party to move out at dawn tomorrow. We'll track it to its lair in the high caves and face it on our own terms, rather than waiting for it to strike first." "That sounds incredibly dangerous," Torvin said quietly. "Dragons are supposed to be most powerful in their own territory, especially in enclosed spaces where their fire can't be avoided." Leif nodded grimly. "We all know the risks. But what choice do we have? If we don't act soon, it might destroy everything we've built here." As if summoned by their conversation, a deep, resonant roar echoed down from the mountains above. It was unlike anything Torvin had ever heard, not just the sound of an angry beast, but something that seemed to contain layers of meaning, almost like a complex musical phrase. The sound raised goosebumps on his arms and made his heart race, though again, not entirely from fear. "There it is," Leif whispered, pointing toward the peaks where a dark shape could be seen, circling against the evening sky. Even at this distance, the dragon's size was impressive. Its wingspan seemed to blot out entire sections of the mountainside as it wheeled through the air with impossible grace. Torvin stared up at the circling figure, and as he watched, an idea began to form in his mind. An idea so unusual and potentially dangerous that he hesitated to even consider it seriously. But the more he thought about it, the more convinced he became that conventional approaches to this crisis were doomed to failure. "Leif," he said slowly, "what if the dragon isn't our enemy?" His friend gave him a look of concern. "What do you mean? It's been terrorizing the region for weeks. How could it not be our enemy?" "But think about its behavior," Torvin pressed. "It attacks food stores and defensive structures, but it goes out of its way to avoid actually harming people. If it wanted to kill, a creature that size and power could have slaughtered hundreds by now. Instead, it seems to be trying to get our attention without causing unnecessary death." "You're suggesting that it's trying to communicate with us?" Leif's tone was skeptical, but not dismissive. He had learned over the years to take his friend's unusual insights seriously, even when they challenged conventional thinking. "I'm suggesting that maybe we've been approaching this all wrong," Torvin said, his excitement growing as the idea took clearer shape in his mind. What if instead of sending a war party to fight the dragon, we tried to understand what it actually wants? What if someone attempted to communicate with it directly? That would be suicide, Leif said flatly. Even if your theory is correct, approaching a dragon would be incredibly dangerous. One moment of miscommunication, and you'd be reduced to ashes. Torven was quiet for a long moment, staring up at the circling figure in the sky. The dragon's flight pattern seemed almost hypnotic, and he found himself wondering what the world looked like from that height. What thoughts might occupy the mind of such an ancient and powerful being? Maybe, he said finally, but what if the person attempting communication wasn't approaching as a warrior or a threat? What if they came with something the dragon recognized as peaceful intent? That night, while the selected warriors made their final preparations for the morning's expedition, Torven lay awake in his cottage, staring at the ceiling and listening to the wind in the pines outside his window. His mind raced with possibilities, most of them terrifying in their implications. The idea that had begun to form during his conversation with Leif refused to leave him alone, growing stronger and more detailed with each passing hour. He rose before dawn and made his way quietly through the sleeping village to the edge of the forest. The dragon was no longer visible in the sky, but somehow Torven could sense its presence in the mountains above, a vast, patient intelligence waiting for something that only it understood. The feeling was similar to what he experienced when forest animals were drawn by his music, but magnified beyond anything he had ever encountered. As the first light of morning began to filter through the trees, Torven made a decision that would have been considered madness by anyone who knew him. He gathered his few precious possessions, his flute, a waterskin, some dried food, and began to climb toward the high mountain passes where the dragon was known to lair. He told himself that he was not planning anything reckless or suicidal. His intention was simply to observe, to get close enough to study the dragon's behavior, and perhaps gain some insight that could help the village find a peaceful solution to their crisis. If he could learn something about the creature's true motivations, he might be able to return with information that would prevent unnecessary bloodshed on both sides. But deep in his heart, Torven knew that he was lying to himself about the true scope of his plan. Something was calling to him from the high peaks, a voice that spoke in frequencies beyond ordinary hearing. Whether it was destiny, madness, or simply the stubborn idealism of youth, he felt compelled to answer that call, regardless of the consequences. The climb was more challenging than he had anticipated. The mountain paths were treacherous, covered with loose scree and patches of ice that made each step potentially dangerous. As he climbed higher, the air grew thinner and colder, forcing him to rest frequently and carefully ration his strength. By midday, he had reached elevations where few villagers ever ventured, entering a realm of stark stone and endless sky that seemed to exist outside the normal boundaries of the human world. It was here, on a narrow ledge overlooking a vast valley, that Torven first saw the dragon's lair clearly. The entrance was a massive cave opening carved into the face of the mountain itself, so large that it could have housed several of the village's biggest buildings. Dark stains around the entrance might have been scorch marks from dragonfire, or they might have been natural mineral deposits. From this distance, it was impossible to tell. But what captured Torven's attention was not the cave itself, but the sound that drifted down from it on the mountain wind. It was a low, musical humming. Not the aggressive roar he had heard the previous evening, but something that sounded almost like a song. The rhythm was complex and alien, yet there was something familiar about it that made his heart race with excitement and recognition. Without fully realizing what he was doing, Torven pulled out his flute and began to play along with the distant melody. The notes that came from his instrument seemed to harmonize naturally with the dragon's song, creating a musical conversation that spanned the impossible distance between them. As he played, the humming from the cave grew stronger and more distinct, as if the dragon was responding to his musical offering. For perhaps an hour, this strange duet continued, with Torvin gradually becoming more confident in his musical responses to the dragon's lead. The conversation, for it was clearly a conversation of some kind, grew increasingly complex, incorporating themes and variations that seemed to convey meaning beyond mere sound. Torvin found himself understanding, on some deep intuitive level, that he was participating in a form of communication that transcended the normal boundaries of language and species. Eventually, the music from the cave stopped, and a profound silence settled over the mountain. Torvin lowered his flute and waited, his heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and terror as he realized that he had just done something unprecedented in the history of his people. He had established contact with the dragon, real, meaningful contact that went beyond the simple dynamics of predator and prey. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Then, gradually, Torvin became aware of a new sound, the whisper of massive wings moving through still air. The dragon was leaving its cave, and from the direction of the sound it was flying directly toward his position on the mountain ledge. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to hide, to do anything except remain exposed on this narrow shelf of stone with nowhere to retreat. But something deeper than instinct held him in place, a certainty that running would destroy whatever fragile connection he had managed to establish with the great creature. If he was to have any hope of understanding the dragon's true intentions, he had to show the same courage in peace that warriors showed in battle. The sound of wings grew closer, accompanied now by the displacement of air that spoke of something immense approaching at considerable speed. Torvin closed his eyes and tried to calm his racing heart, focusing on the memory of the musical conversation he had just shared with the dragon. Whatever happened next, he had already achieved something remarkable. He had proven that communication between human and dragon was possible. When he opened his eyes again, the dragon was there. It hovered in the air, perhaps 50 feet away from the ledge, its massive wings beating with slow, powerful strokes that kept its enormous body aloft with seemingly effortless grace. This close, Torvin could see that the creature was even more magnificent than the distant glimpses had suggested. Its scales were deep emerald green, with gold highlights that caught and reflected the afternoon sunlight like polished metal. Its eyes were large and intelligent, showing none of the mindless aggression that the village stories had led him to expect. But what struck Torvin most powerfully was the sense of ancient sadness that seemed to emanate from the dragon like heat from a forge. This was not a creature driven by simple destructive urges, but a being that carried some profound burden of loneliness and loss. The realization hit him with such force that he felt tears beginning to form in his eyes. "You're not a monster at all," he whispered, though he knew the dragon couldn't possibly understand his words. "You're just lonely." The dragon's great head tilted slightly, as if it was studying him with the same intensity that he was studying it. Then, moving with surprising gentleness for such a massive creature, it settled onto a nearby peak, folding its wings and regarding Torvin with what appeared to be calm curiosity. For several minutes, they simply looked at each other across the gap that separated their species. Then Torvin slowly raised his flute to his lips again and began to play. Not the complex harmonies they had shared earlier, but a simple, gentle melody that spoke of understanding and acceptance. The dragon listened attentively, and when the music ended, it responded with a low, musical sound that seemed to convey gratitude. Years have passed since that fateful day on the mountain, and the story of Torvin and the dragon has become legend throughout the northern lands. What the villagers discovered in the days following Torvin's disappearance into the high peaks was that the young man's instincts had been correct all along. The dragon was not a destroyer, but a guardian, the last of its kind, tasked with protecting ancient secrets hidden deep within the mountains. The creature's attacks on grain stores and defensive structures had been desperate attempts to communicate a warning. A great winter was coming, far worse than any in living memory, and the scattered villages would need to work together and pool their resources to survive. The dragon had been trying to force the communities to abandon their isolated settlements and gather in defensible locations where they could weather the coming storm together. Torvin's musical gift, inherited from his grandmother's line and refined through years of patient practice, had provided the key to understanding this message. Through their shared language of melody and harmony, human and dragon had found a way to bridge the impossible gap between their species. The great winter did come, just as the dragon had warned, bringing with it storms and cold beyond anything recorded in the village histories. But the communities were ready. Guided by the understanding that Torvin and the dragon had achieved together, they had consolidated their resources, shared their knowledge, and created networks of mutual support that allowed them all to survive. When spring finally returned to the northern mountains, it found a changed world. The scattered villages had become a confederation, bound together by shared purpose and mutual respect. And watching over them all, from the high peaks that touched the sky, the last dragon maintained its ancient vigil, no longer alone in its guardianship of the northern realm. Torvin himself became something entirely new in the history of his people. Not a warrior in the traditional sense, but a bridge between worlds, a translator of the deep languages that connect all living things. His flute, carved from simple birchwood, had become an instrument of peace that could speak across the boundaries of species and understanding. The berserker trials were never held again in quite the same way. While the villages still honored their warrior traditions, they had learned that strength came in many forms, and that sometimes the greatest courage lay not in the willingness to fight, but in the wisdom to understand when fighting was unnecessary. And on quiet evenings, when the wind was just right, the people of the Northern Confederation could still hear it, the sound of music drifting down from the high peaks, where a young man and an ancient dragon continued their conversation in the universal language of harmony and hope. In the end, Torvin had discovered that he was not the dragon's master, but something far more precious, its friend. And in a world where such friendships were thought impossible, that discovery changed everything. Did you enjoy this epic tale of courage, music, and the bonds that unite all living beings? Let us know in the comments what you thought of Torvin's journey and which part of the story resonated most with you. Don't forget to subscribe for more legendary tales from the ancient North. And as always, thank you for joining us on this adventure into the realm of dragons and dreams.